Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to talk about the feeding of bulk tank milk. Is it a good practice, or are there things that you as dairy producers should be aware of? Before we get into today's discussion, a reminder that if you have any questions, you can post those there in the chat. And if you're joining us through social media, you can post your questions directly in those channels. So, welcome, Dr. Kurtz. Great to have you back with us today.
Good to be back again.
So go ahead and let's find out about feeding of bulk tank milk.
Well, in this case, bulk tank milk is the control. And what often happens on many of the larger dairy farms, and has been for 20 some years, is feeding waste milk. And waste milk is often the mastitic milk. Cows are treated with antibiotics, so the milk can't be sold, or for other issues, often around calving. So they have to be in a separate pool. So it's become popular because that's viewed as free milk, or you don't want to throw it away, to feed it. And then along with that, that to minimize the problems with bacterial contamination is to pasteurize it. So in this particular case, what you find in the first paragraph of the write-up is a number of references for your benefit about waste milk, how long it's been going on, the problem or the issue of antibiotic treated waste milk, its composition, its variability, all those sorts of things are in the first paragraph. So I'm going to focus now on the study that was done and published in Journal of Dairy Science. It was a very large scale study. 63 male Holstein by Gear crossbred dairy calves were separated from their mothers, and within the first 6 hours they were provided with colostrum at 10% of their body weight, which was also assayed for its concentration of antibodies. And actually the amount of protection was very good. If you see it near the end of that second paragraph, 6.63, 6.63, and 6.58 for the three treatment groups. That's a very high level when usually it's 5 or 5.5 you're looking for. And their body weights, even though they're crossbreds, were right around 82 pounds. So that's a pretty good size for male crossbred calves. So there were three treatments. One was the bulk tank milk. So there should not be any mastitic milk and antibiotic milk in that. And then you have the waste milk, which is either pasteurized or not. So those are the three treatments. Now, if we go further, I've provided more detail in the next two paragraphs if you want to read that instead of going and finding the full article. But the real key was to isolate the waste milk that was treated with antibiotics and then to pasteurize it or not have it pasteurized. So they had to have a separate stream. And then the bulk tank milk, of course, was taken right out of the herd milk source. So that was not pasteurized. It was just raw milk out of that. And then they did some assays, peroxidase and phosphatase enzymes, to determine how effective the pasteurization was. And remember, pasteurization is not sterilization. It may decrease 90 some percent of bacteria and pathogens, but it's not completely sterilized. Okay, there were also two periods of time. Period one was 18 animals, 6 per treatment, and that was for the period of 4 to 30 days. And then period two with the rest of the animals, which were 15 per treatment, and that was from period 4 all the way out to 60 days. And then then these animals were fed on the average about 6 liters divided into two separate feedings during the daily period, and they tried to be very consistent in how they fed them so that was not a variable. The calf starter that was made available free choice along with water was not a very good quality one. It was ground corn, ground soybean meal, and mineral and vitamin supplement. Now, if we look at table one, we can see the composition of the milk fed and the starter. So if we look at the bulk tank milk versus waste milk versus pasteurized, dry matter, it was a little bit higher for the bulk tank milk. And that could be because mastitic milk tends to be lower in solids and lower in fat. And if you look at the fat content, it's the highest for the bulk tank milk. Um, it was only wasn't much lower, 4.1% for waste milk, and pasteurized was 3.76. And protein was similar, a little higher for the waste milk, maybe because a little lower in fat. And then lactose was very similar, although there was a significant difference, a little bit higher for a little bit different for the bulk tank milk. But that's because there's very little variation in lactose. Lactose is really what determines the yield of milk. So it's under very tight genetic control. So you can often find some significant differences on waste milk, on lactose in milk, which doesn't amount to much because it's so little variation. And then the ash, you see, not much difference there. The starter at 19% protein and very low levels of ADF and NDF. Now let's look at the somatic cell counts. You see only 167 with the bulk tank, but a high variation. Whereas the other two, being often mastitic milk, are about 10 times higher. So that's often the case with somatic cells. And total bacteria counts the same thing. It's quite low for the bulk tank milk, but quite a bit higher for waste milk, highest for waste milk, and still fairly high for pasteurized milk. So it didn't kill as much as I thought it would. So that's the composition of what was being fed. Now, they also did some digestibility studies, and I don't have that data in the tables because there were very little differences. And they did them at the first period, 23 to 29 days, and then the second period, 53 to 57. And let's see, they were also slaughtered at the end of the study. All these animals were slaughtered. So you had a group at 30 days, and then you had a group at 60 days. And then of course, they took various organs and measured their contents and their the weight. Um, and they did histological comparisons. And also from the bacteria in the gut, they did, and fecal samples, they looked at antimicrobial susceptibility. And what they found was that there was more antibody resistance to the waste milk samples. Now, if we look at table 2, we can see some information about their performance. The amount of milk fed and consumed was virtually identical, 6 liters are fed in 2 separate feedings, 6 liters a day. The calf starter consumed was very low because that's a very high level of dry matter, 1.7 pounds or so. So that results in very low starter intake. And as you see, from 30 days, it's lowest, but then to 60 days, it approximately is about 3 times higher because that normally increases. But the total starter intake is really quite low. So that means their total dry matter intake was not that high, and their average daily gains were not that high, only about 1.2 pounds at 30 days for the first 30 days. But then up to about 1.5 pounds for the by 60 days of age. So that's to be expected that they would be higher later. Now, some other measurements, digestibilities were not different really. Nitrogen balance differed only at 60 days versus 30 days. Empty body weight components. The only thing they found was a larger liver and the waste and milk treatments. And ruminal measurements, not really much difference, although in 60 days they would have a higher rumen pH. And that's often the case because ruminal pHs start very low in calves, about 5, and they gradually increase to weaning where they get up to 5.5 to maybe sometimes closer to 6. No difference in gastrointestinal measurements, but both waste milk and pasteurized waste milk had resistant E. coli, suggestion that the microbial resistance was greater because they were treated with antibiotics, and that was in the waste milk. And pasteurization does not destroy the antibiotics, whereas, as I said before, it reduces the bacteria counts, should be about 90%, although in this case it wasn't that high. So now let's talk about a few caveats of this study. Well, the first one I already mentioned, it had poor quality calf starter, which would limit the intake and daily gains. The second one was that feeding waste milk seems like a good way to use something that otherwise would be wasted. That's why it's called waste milk. But it's inconsistent in composition and the volume available. And so that means that calves are like babies, human babies. They like consistency. And if there isn't a consistent supply of waste milk or it varies in nutrients, dry matter, um, that means there's variation that can be introduced, that is introduced by feeding waste milk. The last point I wanted to make was the only time this ever happened, but I was visiting a large dairy in the southeast U.S. I was a bit early. The fellow I was with, we got there a little early. So we were in a conference room of the management business office, and the manager wasn't there yet. And he had a whiteboard, and I couldn't help but notice he had some weekly numbers, quite a few, of the herd, information about the herd. And one of the columns was somatic cell counts. What struck me was those somatic cell counts were all below 100,000 units. And this is in the southeast where weather and humidity often make those a challenge to keep low. And so when he came in, the manager came in, I asked him about those numbers. And he said, yes, they were low, and he wanted them to stay low because then he had more milk to sell, less waste milk to feed to his calves, and therefore he bought more milk replacers. I've never heard a dairyman look at it that way before, but his point was, I don't want to feed waste milk calves. I don't want to have enough waste milk to feed my calves. I want to sell more milk. So that's the best thing for me. And then I'll buy more milk replacer, but I'm selling more milk. So that was kind of the aha moment that I've had. Only in one dairy, though.
That's interesting, and it's a very good train of thought. I mean, and you got that consistent supply like you talked about, and the
Yeah.
milk replacer is always going to be there. So, yeah, that's a neat way to look at that. If you haven't seen it already, Dr. Kertz's column is posted there in the chat for you. You can take a look at that. You also can read it in the upcoming November issue of Feedstuffs. So, Dr. Kertz, like we always like to ask, what's your bottom line in all of this?
Well, the bottom line is if you're feeding waste milk, you're dealing with variation and you want to minimize variation. So the least you should do is check the solids level to try to get uh, it to understand how much it might be varying and whether you can do anything to keep it more constant, and including sometimes people will mix a milk replacer with it, but that gets tricky too. But you want to see how consistent it is, especially from a solids level. And then since it's waste milk, it's undoubtedly going to have high bacterial and pathogen counts, so it should be pasteurized. Now you have another operation to monitor and to do quality control, because pasteurization can vary depending on the stream and milk and how well the equipment's working. I remember in one large dairy one time, a dairyman was feeding pasteurized waste milk and then a extender, and he told me, I saw him in a meeting, and he said all of a sudden his calves started having diarrhea and scouring. And he was puzzled why that was happening. I couldn't explain it either. And I saw him later, maybe some months later, another meeting, and I asked him if he found out what happened. He said, "Yeah, our pasteurizer wasn't working properly." So the calves were getting diarrhea because they were getting inoculated. So that's important to have a consistent pasteurization and, and a monitoring system so that you know it's consistent. And then keep in mind that when you're treating cows with antibiotics and the milk is going into this waste milk pool, that pasteurization does not disable the antibiotics, and it may be creating problems down the road. It's not something that's really been studied. And of course, in this study, because they were sacrificing the calves and they were male calves, they weren't able to continue to find out what happens after 2 months of age. So those kind of data and information are still lacking when feeding waste milk to calves.
Very good. Great insight. Appreciate you bringing us up to speed on the importance of knowing your waste milk as you just make those decisions as to whether to feed it or not. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz. Great to see you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in as well. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.